The sun was a pale, aggressive disk in the March sky of 2026, unseasonably hot for a Saturday morning. I could feel the sweat beginning to map a salty trail down my spine as I drove the spade into the stubborn, clay-heavy soil of our backyard. This patch of earth had been neglected for decades, a graveyard of overgrown weeds, rusted lawn furniture from the previous owners, and the skeletal remains of a long-dead oak tree. My brother, Leo, was a few yards away, wrestling with a motorized post-hole auger that screamed with a mechanical fury, kicking up clouds of dry dust. We were supposed to be building a modern privacy fence, a home improvement project meant to distract us from the general malaise of the year. But the ground here didn't want to be disturbed. It felt heavy, resistant, as if it were holding its breath. "Give it a rest, Leo," I shouted over the whine of the machine. "The engine is smoking." Leo killed the power, and the sudden silence that rushed back into the yard was deafening. He wiped his forehead with a grease-stained sleeve, his face flushed a deep, worrying shade of red. "This dirt is like concrete, Elias. Whoever lived here before us must have packed it down with a steamroller." "Keep digging," I muttered, mostly to myself. "We're already 6 inches deep. No turning back now." I moved toward the corner of the property, near where the old oak's roots still clawed at the subsoil. I hoisted the spade and drove it down with the full weight of my body. Instead of the dull thud of earth or the sharp crack of a root, I heard a sound that made the hair on my arm stand up. Clang. It was the unmistakable ring of steel hitting steel. High-pitched, resonant, and entirely out of place in a residential garden. "You hit a pipe?" Leo asked, walking over and leaning on his shovel. "Too shallow for a pipe," I said, my curiosity finally outweighing my exhaustion. "And the sound, it wasn't hollow. It sounded solid." I dropped to my knees, ignoring the damp heat soaking into my jeans, and began to claw away the dirt with my gloved hands. The more I cleared, the more the object revealed itself. It wasn't a pipe, and it wasn't a piece of scrap metal. It was a corner. A sharp, 90-degree angle of dark, oxidized iron. "Help me clear the sides," I whispered. For the next 20 minutes, the fence was forgotten. We worked in a feverish, unspoken rhythm, clearing a rectangular space about 2 feet long and 1 foot wide. What emerged from the earth looked like an antique military ammunition box, the kind you'd see in a grainy documentary about the mid-20th century. It was heavy, rugged, and held shut by a latch that had been reinforced with several thick layers of black duct tape. But the tape had changed over the decades. What was once a sticky adhesive had transformed into a foul, gummy sludge. It looked like necrotic flesh, weeping a dark, oily substance into the surrounding soil. "That's disgusting," Leo said, though he didn't pull away. "Why would someone bury an ammo can under a tree?" "Preppers? A time capsule? Only one way to find out," I said. I grabbed a flathead screwdriver from the tool belt and began to pry at the sludge-covered latch. The smell hit us almost immediately, not the smell of rot, exactly, but something metallic and sharp. It smelled like old pennies and ozone, a scent that felt like it was coating the back of my throat. With a sickening squelch, the tape gave way. I braced my feet against the dirt and pulled the latch. It resisted for a moment, then snapped open with a metallic groan that sounded like a scream. The lid didn't pop open. It was sealed tight by a vacuum of time. I had to wedge the spade into the seam and heave. With a puff of stale, recycled air, the box finally yawned open. We both leaned in, our shadows falling over the interior. Inside, the box was meticulously lined with a heavy, tattered silk scarf. The fabric had once been a vibrant emerald green, but it was now stained with damp, brownish patches. Nestled in the center of the silk, as if it were a holy relic, sat a single VHS tape. In the high-tech world of 2026, seeing a piece of magnetic media felt like looking at a stone tool from the Neolithic era. The black plastic casing was pristine, strangely devoid of the dust or grime that coated everything else in the box. There was no label on the face. No Summer 94 or birthday party written in Sharpie. However, there was something scrawled on the spine of the tape in a cramped, shaky handwriting that looked like it had been carved into the plastic with a needle. Do not watch while they are listening. That's a joke, Leo laughed, though the sound was hollow and brittle. Some kids in the 90s being edgy. It's probably just a recording of The Simpsons or a home movie of someone's cat. I picked the tape up. It was heavier than I remembered tapes being. When I shook it slightly, nothing rattled. The internal reels felt solid, as if the tape inside wasn't just plastic film, but something denser. Leo, look at the house, I said, pointing toward our back porch. What about it? The man we bought this place from. Mr. Henderson. He lived here for 40 years, right? He died in the master bedroom. His kids said he became a recluse toward the end. They told us he used to spend all night sitting in the backyard, just staring at the ground. Leo looked from the tape to the hole in the earth, and then back to the house. The sliding glass door reflected the harsh afternoon sun, making the interior of our home look like a dark, bottomless void. You think he buried this? Leo asked. Look at the depth, I replied. This wasn't just buried. It was hidden. He dug 3 feet down, wrapped it in silk, and sealed it with tape. You don't do that for a recording of a sitcom. A cold breeze swept through the yard, despite the heat. It rustled the leaves of the nearby shrubs with a sound like whispering voices. I felt a sudden, irrational urge to throw the tape back into the hole, to cover it with the heavy clay and the concrete like dirt and forget we ever found it. But curiosity is a parasitic thing. It burrows into your mind and feeds on your logic until all that's left is the need to know. We still have that old VCR in the attic, don't we? Leo asked, his voice low. The one Mom gave us when we moved out. I think so, I said, my fingers tracing the cold plastic of the tape. But we'd need an analog to HDMI converter. The TV won't even have the right ports. I saw one at that thrift shop downtown yesterday. The one that smells like mothballs and wet dogs. I bet they have exactly what we need. I looked down at the box. The rusted iron seemed to be absorbing the sunlight, remaining dark and cold despite the midday glare. The black sludge on the tape was still slowly dripping onto the silk scarf. We shouldn't, I said. We definitely should, Leo countered. I stood up, clutching the tape to my chest. It felt oddly warm now, as if it were drawing heat from my own body. We left the hole open, the rusted ammo box discarded in the dirt like an empty shell. As we walked toward the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that the backyard was watching us, that the empty space where the box had been was a wound that we had just reopened. Inside the house, the air conditioning was humming, a steady, mechanical drone that usually felt comforting. Today, it sounded like static. I placed the tape on the kitchen counter. In the bright, LED light of the modern kitchen, the handwritten warning on the spine seemed to vibrate. Do not watch while they are listening. Who are they? I whispered. Leo was already grabbing his car keys. Give me 20 minutes. I'll get the adapter. Don't do anything until I get back. I couldn't if I wanted to, I said, staring at the black plastic brick. As the front door slammed shut behind him, the house fell into a heavy, oppressive silence. I looked at the tape, and for a split second, I could swear I saw the magnetic reels inside move just a fraction of an inch, as if something were winding itself up, waiting for the play button to be pressed. The 20 minutes Leo promised stretched into an hour. In that time, the silence of the house began to feel less like a lack of noise and more like a physical weight pressing against my eardrums. I sat at the kitchen island, my eyes locked on the VHS tape. In the clinical, white light of our 2026 kitchen, all smart appliances and touch screens, the black plastic slab looked like an invasive species. It didn't belong in this decade. It didn't belong in this light. Every few minutes, the refrigerator would hum to life, a sleek, modern purr that usually went unnoticed. But today, every mechanical sound made me flinch. I kept thinking about the dirt under my fingernails and the way that iron box had felt, unnaturally cold, as if it had been refrigerated by the earth itself. When Leo finally burst through the front door, the sound was like a gunshot. He was red-faced and panting, clutching a plastic bag with a thank you logo that looked like it had been crumpled and smoothed out 100 times. "I got it," he gasped, tossing the bag onto the counter next to the tape. "And you won't believe the luck. The guy at the thrift store, this old dude who looked like he hadn't seen the sun since the turn of the millennium, he had a VCR buried in the back of the shop. A gold star. Said it was a tank. He even threw in the RCA to HDMI converter for an extra $10. He pulled out the VCR. It was a bulky, silver-gray monstrosity with a layer of grime that no amount of wet wiping would ever truly remove. It smelled of burnt ozone, old libraries, and the peculiar, sharp scent of decomposing capacitors. "Is it even going to work?" I asked, eyeing the ancient power cord. He tested it right there. "Plays like a dream," Leo said, already moving toward the living room. "Clear the space under the TV. We need to do this now." There was an frantic energy in Leo that I didn't like. He was moving too fast, his hands shaking slightly as he began to untangle the web of cables behind our 75-inch OLED television. We were attempting a feat of electronic archaeology, forcing a machine built in the 1990s to communicate with a screen designed for the ultra-high-definition future. "Wait, Leo," I said, grabbing his wrist. "The warning on the tape. Do not watch while they are listening." "Don't you think we should?" "I don't know, think about what that means." Leo pulled his arm away, his eyes bright with a feverish curiosity. "It's a prank, Elias. Or it's some weird art project. People in the 90s were obsessed with Blair Witch type stuff. It's just flavor. Now, hold this converter while I plug in the yellow cable." I sighed and knelt beside him. We worked in the dim light behind the TV stand, connecting the red, white, and yellow RCA cables into the converter box, which in turn plugged into the HDMI 4 port. It felt like trying to perform a heart transplant with a hammer and sickle. Finally, the VCR was powered on. A small, green digital clock on the front of the machine flickered to life, flashing 12 o'clock. 12 o'clock, 12 o'clock. With a rhythmic, mocking persistence. "Okay," Leo whispered. "Switch the TV input." I picked up the remote and scrolled through the inputs. When I hit HDMI 4, the screen didn't stay black. It exploded into a violent, churning sea of gray and white static. The white noise of the analog age roared out of our surround sound speakers, a harsh, abrasive hiss that sounded like 1,000 snakes. "Turn it down," Leo yelled over the noise. I fumbled with the remote, dropping the volume until the hiss was a low, menacing growl. The static on the screen was mesmerizing in a disgusting way. It felt like looking at a swarm of insects. "The tape," Leo said, reaching for the black plastic brick on the coffee table. He handled it with a strange kind of reverence now. He stepped toward the VCR and pushed the tape into the slot. The machine didn't take it gracefully. It made a series of heavy, mechanical clunks or clack grind as the internal teeth of the VCR bit into the tape and dragged it into its belly. For a horrifying second, I thought the machine was going to eat the film, but then there was a final, solid thump. The wordplay appeared in the upper left corner of the screen in a blocky, neon green font. The static didn't disappear, but it changed. The chaotic white noise smoothed out into horizontal bands of tracking distortion. Then, with a flicker that made my eyes ache, a picture stabilized. It was our backyard. But it was a version of our backyard that felt like a half-remembered dream. The massive, skeletal oak tree that we had been digging near this morning was alive in the video. Its branches were heavy with lush, green leaves, casting a deep, cooling shadow over the grass. The fence we were currently replacing didn't exist. Instead, there was a low, charming stone wall that must have crumbled away decades ago. "The quality is surprisingly good," I whispered, leaning closer to the screen. "It's a fixed camera," Leo noted. "Tripod, maybe. Look at the timestamp." In the bottom right corner, white digital numbers flickered, September 14, 1996. The footage was silent. There was no wind, no birdsong, just a profound, empty stillness. For several minutes, we watched the light change on the grass as clouds passed over the sun. It was incredibly mundane, yet I couldn't look away. There was a tension in the frame, a sense that the camera was waiting for something to happen. "Why would someone record 10 minutes of a lawn?" Leo asked, his bravado finally starting to slip. "Maybe they weren't recording the lawn," I said. "Maybe they were recording the house." The camera angle was positioned from the very edge of the woods, looking back toward the rear of our home. In 1996, the house looked newer, the white siding blindingly bright. The windows were dark, reflecting the garden. Suddenly, the snow on the screen intensified. A loud, rhythmic thumping sound started to bleed through the speakers. It wasn't part of the recorded audio, it sounded like someone was tapping a microphone with a rhythmic, heartbeat-like cadence. Thump thump. Thump thump. "Leo, turn it off," I said, a cold lump of dread forming in my stomach. "Wait, look. Someone's coming out." On the screen, the back door of the house creaked open. A man stepped out onto the porch. He was dressed in a heavy flannel shirt despite the apparent heat of a September afternoon. He was carrying a shovel in one hand and a small, rectangular object in the other. It was the iron box. The man walked with a strange, jerky gait, his head twitching from side to side as if he were listening for something just out of range. He didn't look at the camera. He walked straight to the base of the oak tree, the exact spot where we had been digging only hours ago. He began to dig. He worked with a frantic, desperate energy, his movements blurred by the low frame rate of the VHS tape. He wasn't just burying the box, he was trying to hide it. He kept pausing to look back at the house, his eyes wide and white in the grainy footage. "That's Mr. Henderson," Leo whispered. "But he looks younger. And terrified." As Henderson finished burying the box, the camera began to shake. It wasn't on a tripod. Someone was holding it. The person behind the lens began to move forward, creeping through the tall grass toward the man at the tree. The thump-thump sound in the audio grew louder, faster. Henderson stood up, wiping the dirt from his hands. He looked directly at the spot where the camera was hiding. His face went pale even through the grain and the static, the absolute horror in his expression was unmistakable. He didn't run. He didn't scream. He walked toward the camera. As he got closer, his face filled the screen. His eyes were bloodshot, his lips trembling. He leaned in until his nose was almost touching the lens. He didn't look at the person holding the camera. He looked past the lens, his gaze piercing through the 30 years of time, straight into the living room where Leo and I sat. He raised a single, trembling finger to his lips. "SHHH," he seemed to mouth, though no sound came out. Then, he looked up. Not at the person filming him, but at the sky above the house. His jaw dropped open in a silent wail of agony. Behind him, in the reflection of the glass back door, something moved. It wasn't a person. It was a tall, impossibly thin shadow that seemed to stretch out of the very air itself. It didn't have a face, just a void where features should be. The VCR let out a horrific, high-pitched squeal. The screen turned a violent shade of purple, and then the image cut to black. "Did you see that?" Leo whispered, his voice cracking. In the reflection. What was that? I didn't answer. I couldn't. I was looking at the VCR. The digital clock, which had been flashing 12 o'clock, was now counting up. But it wasn't counting seconds. The numbers were spinning frantically, blurring into a chaotic mess of green light. A sound started to rise from the basement. It was a low, rhythmic thump-thump, the same sound from the tape. But this wasn't coming from the speakers. It was coming from the floorboards beneath our feet. "Leo," I said, my voice trembling. "They are listening." The VCR suddenly ejected the tape with such force that it flew across the room, skidding across the hardwood floor. The TV screen remained on, but the static was gone. It was just a solid, glowing gray. In the reflection of the gray screen, I saw our living room. I saw Leo. I saw myself. And standing directly behind us, in the dark hallway that led to the kitchen, I saw a tall, impossibly thin shadow that shouldn't have been there. The shadow wasn't there. When I spun around, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, the hallway was empty. The dim LED strip lights we'd installed under the kitchen cabinets flickered once, twice, and then settled into a steady, sterile glow. But the cold remained. It wasn't the chill of an air conditioner, it was a localized, biting frost that seemed to radiate from the very spot where the tall, thin shape had stood in the reflection. "Elias?" Leo's voice was a jagged whisper. He hadn't turned around yet. He was still staring at the gray, glowing screen of the TV, his face drained of all color. "Tell me you saw that. Tell me I'm just having a stroke." "I saw it," I said, my voice sounding distant, as if I were underwater. "But it's gone. It was just a trick of the light. Contrast. Perspective." I didn't believe a word of it. My skin was crawling with a primal flight or fight response that my brain couldn't rationalize away. I walked over to the VCR. The machine was vibrating, a low-frequency hum that I could feel in the soles of my feet. The digital clock was still a chaotic blur of green segments, spinning too fast to read. On the floor, the VHS tape lay where it had been spat out. I reached down to pick it up, but as my fingers brushed the plastic, I hissed and pulled back. "It's burning hot." "The tape." Leo finally turned, his eyes wide. "The plastic is nearly melting," I said, looking at the black casing. The thump-thump from the floorboards had stopped, replaced by a silence so profound it felt like the house had been sucked into a vacuum. We stood there for a long time, two grown men paralyzed in a high-tech living room, terrified of a piece of outdated technology. "We need to know what he was looking at," Leo said suddenly. His fear was transforming into that dangerous, obsessive curiosity again. It was his coping mechanism. If he could categorize the horror, he could control it. "In the tape. Before it cut out." He wasn't looking at the camera guy. He was looking at us. "Don't be ridiculous, Leo. That was recorded 30 years ago. We were toddlers. Time isn't linear on that tape, Elias. Did you see the reflection in the glass door? That wasn't a 1996 living room. It was this room. I saw the blue light from our soundbar. I saw the shape of your head." I wanted to argue, to call him crazy, but I had seen it too. The grain of the film had been thick, but the geometry of the reflection was unmistakable. It was a bridge. The tape wasn't just a record of the past, it was a window that looked both ways. "We have to play it again," Leo insisted. He grabbed a pair of oven mitts from the kitchen, a surreal sight that would have been funny in any other context, and picked up the hot tape. "Leo, no. The warning said do not watch while they are listening. I think they just arrived. Then we need to find out how to get rid of them. Look at the spine again." He held the tape up. The carved handwriting "do not watch while they are listening" seemed deeper now, the plastic around the letters charred. But beneath that line, a new set of scratches had appeared, as if they had been etched from the inside out. "Find the second key." "The second key?" I whispered. "What does that even mean? Is there another tape?" "The man, Mr. Henderson, he didn't just bury the box. He was hiding a sequence," Leo said, his voice gaining speed. "Think about the garden." He looked at the sky, then he looked at us, and then he pointed to his lips. He was giving us a signal. A set of coordinates, maybe. Or a physical location in this house. We decided to wait until the tape cooled down. While we waited, I grabbed my laptop. I started searching through property records, old obituaries, anything I could find on Arthur Henderson. The digital world felt safe, a fortress of data against the encroaching analog nightmare. I found a clipping from a local newspaper dated October 1998. "Local man claims voices in the soil are stealing his sleep." It was a short, mocking human interest piece about an eccentric gardener who had been fined for digging up his entire backyard in search of the hum. According to the article, Henderson had claimed that the ground was recording him, and that the only way to stop the playback was to bury the silence. "He wasn't crazy," I muttered, showing the screen to Leo. "He was being haunted by the very ground we're standing on." Leo didn't look at the laptop. He was staring out the sliding glass door into the backyard. The sun was setting now, casting long, distorted shadows across the lawn. The hole we had dug earlier looked like a black mouth, waiting to be fed. "Elias," Leo said, his voice trembling. "Look at the tree." I stood up and joined him at the window. The old oak tree, the one that was dead and skeletal in 2026, looked different. In the fading twilight, the branches didn't look quite so bare. For a fleeting second, I saw a shimmer of green, a ghost of the lush leaves we had seen on the tape. The backyard was beginning to sync with the 1996 footage. The past was bleeding into the present like ink in a glass of water. "It's happening," Leo whispered. "The tape, it's a catalyst." He didn't wait for my approval. He strode back to the VCR, which had finally stopped vibrating. He shoved the tape back in. This time, the machine didn't groan. It swallowed the tape with a hungry, metallic click. The screen flickered. The static returned, but it was louder now, a cacophony of shrieks and whispers that seemed to resolve into distorted sentences. "Below the roots, the glass is thin, he sees you." The footage started exactly where it had left off. Henderson was standing at the base of the tree, his face pressed against the camera lens. But this time, he wasn't silent. A sound began to leak from the speakers, a wet, rasping sound of someone trying to speak through a throat full of soil. "The cellar." The man on the screen wheezed. His eyes were darting toward the house. "Under, the vanity." "We don't have a cellar," I said, my heart racing. "This house is built on a slab. There's no basement, just a crawl space." "Arthur lived here when the house was different," Leo said, his eyes glued to the screen. "Look at the background." On the TV, the man moved away from the camera. He began to walk toward the house, but as he moved, the backyard on the screen started to distort. The trees stretched upward like melting wax. The sky turned a bruised, oily purple. Henderson reached the back door and looked back one last time. He wasn't looking at the camera anymore. He was looking at the reflection in the glass. He pointed a shaking hand at the reflection of Leo. "You," the man on the tape said, his voice suddenly clear and booming through our modern speakers. "You're the one who lets them in. Stop the reel. Stop the reel." Suddenly, the footage shifted. It wasn't Henderson anymore. It was a shot of our living room taken from the perspective of the TV. I saw myself sitting on the sofa, looking at my phone. I saw Leo standing by the VCR. The footage was in high definition, but it was coated in that sickening, grainy VHS filter. I looked at the screen and saw the tall, thin shadow standing right behind me. In the video, the shadow reached out a long, multi-jointed finger and touched the back of my neck. In the real world, I felt a touch that was colder than ice. It was a needle prick of absolute zero against my skin. Leo. Shut it off. I screamed, lunging for the power cord. But Leo was frozen. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the VCR. The machine was glowing a dull, internal ember light that seemed to be melting the plastic casing from the inside. I can't. Leo yelled. The buttons are gone. I looked. The front of the VCR was smooth, the plastic having flowed over the buttons and the tape slot like liquid. The machine was a seamless block of silver gray, fused shut. The audio on the TV began to loop. Stop the reel, stop the reel, stop the reel, faster and faster until it became a single, piercing hum. Then, the man in the garden appeared on the screen again. But he wasn't in 1996. He was standing in our backyard, right now, visible through the sliding glass door in the background of the video. I turned my head to look at the real glass door. There was a man standing there. He was wearing a flannel shirt. He was covered in wet earth. His eyes were wide and filled with an ancient, exhausting terror. He wasn't a ghost, he looked solid, his breath fogging the glass of the door. He began to pound on the glass not to get in, but as if he were trying to warn us. He pointed down. Not at the garden, but at the floor beneath our feet. The vanity, I whispered, remembering his words. The master bathroom. I grabbed Leo by the shoulder and hauled him toward the hallway. We ran, leaving the screaming TV and the fused VCR behind. We burst into the master bathroom, the smell of ozone following us like a hungry dog. The bathroom was modern marble countertops, a dual sink vanity, and a large mirror. I grabbed the edge of the heavy wooden cabinet and pulled. It was bolted to the wall, but I didn't care. With a surge of adrenaline-fueled strength, I kicked the baseboards, shattering the thin plywood. Beneath the vanity, hidden under a layer of dust and old plumbing, was a trapdoor. It was made of the same rusted iron as the ammunition box. It had no handle, only a circular indentation in the center the exact size and shape of a VHS reel. The second key, Leo breathed, his voice trembling. It's not another tape. We need the reel from the one inside the machine. From the living room, we heard the sound of glass shattering. The man in the garden wasn't pounding anymore. He was inside. And he wasn't alone. The rhythmic thump-thump returned, louder than ever, shaking the walls of the house. The shadow I had seen in the reflection wasn't a shadow anymore. It was a sound. It was a presence. It was the they the tape had warned us about. We have to get that tape out, I said, looking at the hallway. Even if we have to break the machine. Elias, Leo said, his voice small. Look at the mirror. I looked. In the bathroom mirror, the room was different. The marble was gone, replaced by cracked porcelain and rotting wood. And standing in the doorway behind us, reflected in the glass, was the man in the garden. He wasn't looking at us. He was looking at the trapdoor. Open it, he whispered. His voice didn't come from his mouth, it came from the mirror. Open it, or we all become part of the static. The bathroom mirror didn't just reflect a different room, it reflected a different reality. In the silvered glass, the sleek, modern porcelain of our 2026 renovation was replaced by a cramped, yellowing space from the late 90s. The air in the reflection looked heavy, choked with the grain of a low-quality recording. And standing in the doorway not behind us in the real room, but behind us in the glass was Arthur Henderson. His flannel shirt was shredded, his skin the color of wet parchment. He looked like a man who had been folded and unfolded 1,000 times. He didn't speak with his mouth, his lips remained pressed together in that eternal, silent shhh, but his voice vibrated directly into our skulls, a frequency that felt like teeth scraping on a chalkboard. The reel, the voice echoed. The center of the spiral. You brought the signal back. Now you must finish the circuit. We don't have it. Leo shouted, his voice cracking with a hysteria he could no longer suppress. The machine melted. It's fused shut. Arthur's reflection leaned closer to the glass. His eyes weren't eyes anymore, they were spinning black spools of magnetic tape. Then break it. Before the broadcast finishes. If the tape reaches the end of the spool while you are in the room, the transition becomes permanent. I looked at the hallway. The living room was only 20 feet away, but the air between here and there was shimmering with visual interference. Horizontal bands of gray distortion tracking lines were drifting through the air like ghost ribbons. The sound coming from the TV had shifted from a hum to a rhythmic, mechanical grinding, like a giant clockwork heart struggling to beat. I'll go, I said. My hands were shaking so violently I had to clench them into fists. Leo, stay here. Keep the trapdoor clear. If I get that reel, I'm throwing it to you. Elias, no, Leo whispered, grabbing my arm. Look at the floor. I looked down. The hardwood of the hallway was beginning to lose its definition. The sharp lines of the planks were blurring, turning into oversized, blocky pixels. The house was literally losing resolution. We weren't just being haunted, we were being digitized, pulled into the same decaying medium as the tape. I pulled away from Leo and stepped into the hallway. The moment I left the bathroom, the temperature plummeted. The smell of ozone was so thick I could taste copper on my tongue. Every step felt like wading through deep water. I watched my own hand as I reached for the wall, it flickered, my fingers momentarily doubling and then snapping back together like a glitching video. The living room was a nightmare of analog feedback. The 75-inch TV was no longer displaying a picture, it was a screaming window of pure white light that illuminated the figure standing in the center of the room. It was the shadow. The listener. It stood nearly 7 feet tall, a silhouette of static that seemed to suck the light out of the air. It didn't have a solid form, it was a shifting mass of snow and jagged black edges. It didn't move by walking. It glitched. 1 second it was by the sofa, the next, it was 3 feet closer, its movements instantaneous and nauseating to watch. It was listening. Its head, a featureless oval of flickering gray, was tilted at an unnatural angle, tracking the sound of my breathing. Do not watch while they are listening. I closed my eyes. If the entity was tied to the visual medium of the tape, perhaps not looking at it would offer some protection. I moved by memory, sliding my feet across the pixelating floor toward the TV stand. The sound of the VCR was deafening now, a high-pitched mechanical whine that suggested the internal motor was spinning at thousands of revolutions per minute. I reached the VCR. The plastic was no longer hot, it felt like frozen oil, slippery and unnaturally smooth. It had completely encased the tape. I felt around the back of the unit, my fingers searching for the power cord. I found it and yanked. Nothing happened. The machine stayed lit, the internal amber glow pulse speeding in time with the thumping in the floorboards. It was no longer drawing power from the wall, it was drawing it from the house, or perhaps from me. I opened my eyes just a crack. The shadow was standing directly on the other side of the TV stand. It was so close I could hear the sound it made, not a breath, but a low bit-rate hiss, like a radio tuned to a dead station. I grabbed a heavy bronze decorative bust from the shelf, a gift from our mother we always hated, and hoisted it high. Elias! Watch out! Leo's scream came from the bathroom. The shadow glitched. It was suddenly leaning over me, its arms extending like ribbons of distorted film. I didn't think. I swung the bronze bust with every ounce of terror-fueled strength I possessed. I didn't hit the shadow. It wasn't solid. My weapon passed through the static with a sickening zip sound, like tearing silk. But the momentum carried the bust down onto the VCR. Crack. The plastic casing shattered. A spray of sparks, neon blue and smelling of sulfur, erupted into the room. The TV screen shattered simultaneously, the glass imploding inward. The VCR groaned one last time and died. In the sudden, jarring silence, I saw the tape. The casing was broken open, the black magnetic film spilled out like a heap of shiny, dead snakes. But in the center of the wreckage sat the two white plastic reels. One was empty. The other was full of tape, glowing with a faint, sickly luminescence. I lunged for it. My hand passed through a band of tracking distortion that sent a jolt of agonizing numbness up my arm, but I closed my fingers around the plastic spool. It felt vibrate, alive, like a captured heart. The shadow let out a sound that shattered the remaining windows in the room, a digital scream of pure, uncompressed data. The floor beneath me gave way, the pixels dissolving into a void of gray static. Leo. Catch. I didn't look. I twisted my body and hurled the glowing reel down the hallway toward the bathroom door. I saw it spin through the air, a disk of light cutting through the gloom. Leo's hand reached out from the bathroom, catching the reel mid-air. The shadow turned its attention toward him, its form stretching out, becoming a long, jagged spear of black noise. It lunged down the hallway, moving with the speed of a frame skip. "Close the door!" I yelled, but I was falling. The living room floor had become a soft, yielding marsh of gray squares. I was sinking into the static, my legs disappearing into a sea of salt and pepper noise. Leo didn't close the door. He didn't have time. Instead, he slammed the reel into the circular indentation on the iron trapdoor. The house shook. A sound like a massive heavy-duty magnet being switched on echoed through the foundations. A brilliant, gold-white light erupted from the bathroom, clashing with the gray static of the hallway. The shadow froze. It began to flicker violently, its form jumping between the hallway, the kitchen, and the garden. It was being pulled in two directions. Arthur Henderson's voice returned, but this time it wasn't a whisper. It was a command. "The circuit is closed. Record over US." Leo turned the reel. The iron trapdoor didn't just open, it began to spin. It acted like a vacuum, pulling the loose magnetic tape from the living room, drawing the static out of the air, and sucking the shadow toward it. The entity fought, its long, flickering limbs clawing at the walls, leaving gouges of unrendered blackness in the drywall. I felt the suction too. I was being pulled out of the pixel swamp. I scrambled toward the bathroom, my hands gripping the blurring edges of the floorboards. "Hold on, Elias." Leo was leaning out of the bathroom, one hand on the trapdoor, the other reaching for me. His face was a mask of concentration. The light from the trapdoor was reflecting in his eyes, turning them into glowing gold orbs. Behind him, in the mirror, I saw the 1996 version of the bathroom beginning to collapse. Arthur Henderson was standing in the center of the light, his arms spread wide, welcoming the end of the loop. I grabbed Leo's hand. He hauled me toward the bathroom just as the shadow gave one final, earth-shaking shriek. The entity was sucked into the trapdoor like smoke into a vent. Leo slammed the iron lid shut. The silence that followed was absolute. We lay on the bathroom floor, gasping for air. The smell of ozone was fading, replaced by the mundane scent of dust and sweat. I looked at my hands. They were solid again. No flickering. No pixels. The mirror was just a mirror. It showed two terrified brothers in a half-demolished bathroom. There was no Arthur Henderson. There was number 1996. But the house was different. The walls were still covered in the gouges left by the shadow. The VCR was a pile of melted scrap in the living room. And the trapdoor. The trapdoor was gone. In its place was a smooth, seamless patch of concrete, as if it had never existed. "Is it over?" Leo whispered. I stood up, my legs feeling like lead. I walked back into the living room. The TV was a jagged skeleton of plastic and glass. The backyard was visible through the shattered sliding door. The sun had finally set, and the moon was rising over the old, dead oak tree. I looked at the spot where we had found the box. The hole was still there. But sitting on the edge of the hole was something new. It was a small, digital memory card. A 2026 version of a message in a bottle. I walked out into the cool night air, my boots crunching on the dry grass. I picked up the card. It was cold, so cold it felt like it had been buried in the heart of a glacier. "Leo," I called out, my voice trembling. "It's not over. It's just updated." The moon hung over the backyard like a cataract's clouded eye, casting a sterile, silver light over the ruins of our afternoon. I stood at the edge of the pit, the small micro SD card pinched between my thumb and forefinger. It felt impossibly light, yet its presence was heavier than the iron box had ever been. In 2026, we were surrounded by data, terabytes of it floating in the cloud, invisible and ethereal. But this felt different. This was data with mass. Data with gravity. "Elias, put it down," Leo said from the porch. He was leaning against the doorframe, his clothes torn, his face a map of soot and sweat. "We won. We closed the trapdoor. We're done." "It was sitting on the edge of the hole, Leo," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "The Earth didn't just give us the tape. It swapped it. This is the update." I walked back into the house, stepping over the shattered glass of the sliding door. The living room was a graveyard of 20th century technology. The Gold Star VCR was a blackened husk, its plastic guts spilled across the rug. The smell of burnt silicon hung in the air like a heavy curtain. I went to the kitchen island and opened my laptop. The screen flickered to life, its clean, high-resolution glow feeling like a sanctuary after the jagged, grainy nightmare of the VHS. "Don't do it," Leo warned, his voice gaining a sharp edge of panic. "Arthur said to stop the reel. He said to record over them. If you plug that in, you're just opening another door. If we don't know what it is, we're just waiting for it to find us again," I countered. The tape was analog, it was slow, it was physical. This is digital. If the listeners are on this card, they're already in the air. They're in the Wi-Fi. They're in the smart locks. We have to know if we actually stopped it. With a trembling hand, I slid the card into the adapter and pushed it into the side of the laptop. The computer didn't lag. There was no spinning wheel of death. A single folder appeared on the desktop, labeled with a string of numbers that looked disturbingly like a date, March 19, 2026. Today's date. Inside the folder was one file, final_log.mp4. I clicked it. The video didn't start with static. It started in 8K resolution, so clear it felt like looking through a window. The camera was positioned in the corner of our living room exactly where the shadow had stood. The footage showed Leo and me, sitting at the kitchen island. It was showing us, right now. In the video, I was looking at the laptop, and Leo was standing behind me, just as he was in reality. We watched ourselves on the screen. The delay was less than a second. It was a perfect, digital mirror. "Elias, shut it off," Leo breathed. He stepped closer to the laptop, and on the screen, his digital counterpart did the same. "It's a live feed. But there's no camera there. How is it recording us?" "Look at the timestamp," I said, pointing to the bottom of the player window. The video wasn't just a live feed. The progress bar showed a duration of 4 hours. The video was 4 hours long. I grabbed the slider and dragged it forward, 2 hours into the future. The image shifted. The house was dark. Leo and I were no longer in the kitchen. The footage showed the backyard, but the oak tree was gone. In its place was a towering structure of black, jagged metal, a spire that looked like it had been grown from the soil rather than built. Around the spire, hundreds of figures were standing in the moonlight. They weren't shadows. They were people. Our neighbors. Our friends. They were all standing perfectly still, their heads tilted at that same unnatural angle, their mouths open in a silent, collective wail. "Is that us?" Leo whispered, pointing to the front of the crowd. Two figures stood at the base of the spire. One was wearing my blue hoodie, the other was wearing Leo's work shirt. Their skin was translucent, flickering with digital artifacts. They weren't humans anymore, they were high-fidelity recordings, trapped in a loop of eternal observation. I dragged the slider to the very end of the video, the final 10 seconds. The camera angle changed. It was no longer in the living room or the garden. It was looking out from the perspective of the laptop screen itself. I saw my own face, illuminated by the blue light of the monitor. But in the video, my face began to distort. My eyes stretched into black spools. My skin turned into a landscape of salt and pepper noise. Behind my digital self, a hand reached out. It wasn't the shadow's hand. It was a human hand, old and weathered, wearing a heavy flannel sleeve. Arthur Henderson. In the video, Arthur leaned into my ear and whispered something. The audio was crystal clear. The tape was the cage. The card is the key. You didn't bury the silence, Elias. You broadcasted it? Suddenly, the laptop's cooling fans began to scream, spinning at a rate that sounded like a jet engine. The casing became hot to the touch. On the screen, the video began to repeat the last 3 seconds over and over again. Arthur's hand reaching out. Arthur's hand reaching out. Arthur's hand reaching out. The Wi-Fi, I gasped, realization hitting me like a physical blow. Leo, the router. It's uploading. I looked at the taskbar. The upload icon was pulsing frantically. The file final_log.mp4 wasn't just a video, it was a virus, a piece of sentient code that was using our home network to bridge the gap between the listeners and the rest of the world. I lunged for the router, tearing the cables out of the wall, but the green lights continued to blink. It was drawing power from the air, from the same atmospheric energy that had fueled the VCR. "It's too late," Leo said. He was standing by the window, looking out at the street. I joined him. Outside, the street lights were flickering in a rhythmic pattern, thump-thump, thump-thump. In the house across the street, the flickering blue light of a television was visible through the curtains. Then, the house next to that. One by one, every window on the block began to glow with that same, sickly gray static. Our neighbors were coming out of their front doors. They weren't screaming. They weren't running. They were simply standing on their lawns, tilting their heads toward our house, listening to the silent broadcast we had just triggered. "The loop," I whispered. "Arthur didn't bury the tape to hide it from the world. He buried it to hide the world from it. He was the last one left. He thought if he stayed in the garden, if he kept the circuit closed, the signal would die with him. And we dug it up," Leo said, a terrifyingly calm smile spreading across his face. I looked at my brother. His eyes were starting to flicker. For a split second, I saw the snow behind his pupils. "Leo? Leo, look at me. It's so quiet now, Elias," he said, his voice sounding like a low bitrate recording. "Can't you hear it? The static, it's not noise. It's a song. They've been waiting so long for a high-speed connection." He turned away from me and walked toward the shattered sliding door. He stepped out into the backyard and walked toward the hole. He didn't stop until he was standing exactly where Arthur Henderson had stood in 1996. He looked up at the sky. His jaw dropped open. I ran to the kitchen and grabbed the laptop. I had to destroy it. I had to break the link. I raised the device over my head, intending to smash it against the marble counter, but my arms froze. I couldn't move. My muscles felt like they had been programmed to stay still. On the laptop screen, a new window popped up. It was a command prompt, lines of code scrolling by at a dizzying speed. Source, backyard_excavation_2026. Target, global_network_v.6.0. Status, 99% complete. I watched, helpless, as the progress bar hit 100%. The world didn't end with a bang. It ended with a click. The lights in the house went out. The street lights went out. The entire city was plunged into a darkness so deep it felt like being buried alive. But then, a billion small lights flickered on. Every smartphone in the city, every tablet, every smartwatch, every billboard in Times Square, they all lit up at once. They all showed the same thing, a grainy, black and white image of a man in a flannel shirt, standing in a garden, holding a finger to his lips. SHHH. The sound that followed was a global hum, a frequency that resonated in the bones of every living creature on Earth. It was the sound of the signal finally being received. I felt the cold then. The same needle prick of absolute zero I had felt in the hallway. I turned my head, the only part of my body I could still control, and looked at the kitchen window. In the reflection of the glass, I didn't see myself. I saw a tall, thin shadow. It was wearing my clothes. It was holding my laptop. It was living my life. And I was on the other side of the glass. I was standing in a garden where the trees were smaller and the fence hadn't been built yet. I looked down at my hands and saw that they were made of grain and light. I was the recording now. I was the ghost in the machine. Beside me, Arthur Henderson appeared. He looked tired. He handed me a rusted ammunition box and a roll of black duct tape. "You have to hurry," Arthur said, his voice a distorted wheeze. "The next ones, the brothers, they'll be here in 30 years. You have to make sure the tape is deep enough." I looked toward the house that was no longer mine. I saw two small children playing in the yard, their laughter sounding like distant static. One of them looked like Leo. One of them looked like me. I picked up the shovel. The soil was heavy and resistant, as if it were holding its breath. I began to dig, marking the spot where the cycle would begin again. I worked until the sun began to rise, a pale, aggressive disk in the March sky. I placed the box into the hole. I wrapped it in a silk scarf. I sealed it with tape that would eventually turn into a gummy, black sludge. And right before I covered it up, I looked into the lens of a camera that wasn't there yet. I looked past the time, past the static, straight into the eyes of the person who would one day find it. I raised a trembling finger to my lips. SHHH, I mouthed. Then I reached out and pressed stop.